One of the great libraries of the world is the Bibliothèque Nationale right here in Paris. Among other things, it has about 400 Greek New Testament manuscripts, and among those are quite a few that are of extreme importance for New Testament studies. I want to talk to you about one of those manuscripts known as Ephraemi Rescriptus. This manuscript is so called because it was scraped over again by a later scribe centuries after it was written on, and that scribe put down the sermons of Saint Ephraim the Syrian. Now, he did that in the 13th century, and he wrote it all in Greek, but those letters that he wrote were written on top of another text, and that text was originally written in the 5th century. Now, as is customary for most New Testament manuscripts, they're written on parchment or animal skins that have been scraped to a pretty fine point so that it's almost as thin as our modern paper, at least the better quality parchment known as vellum would be. And what happened is this scribe in the 13th century, 800 years after the original scribe wrote on this text, he went through and scraped all that original text off as well as he possibly could, and then he wrote other Greek text on top of it, making it very difficult to read what was underneath. This happens to be what's called a palimpsest, and that's simply a Greek word that means scraped again. Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus is the most important biblical palimpsest known to exist. I had the opportunity to examine it today, and I spent some time with the manuscript going over every leaf, and I noticed that they had done a chemical reagent to it, and this was done about 170 years ago actually, where they put some chemicals on each leaf, basically painted it on the leaves to find out where the undertext was, so it would bring that text up and make it more visible, and the upper text would be subdued somewhat. Now, again, as I said, this was done about 160, 170 years ago. By doing this, that actually hurts the manuscript, and the manuscript is getting more deteriorated as time goes on, but at the same time, it's now easier to read that undertext than ever before. It was in the year 1843 and 1844 that a German scholar by the name of Constantin von Tischendorf came to Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris to examine that manuscript. He spent, as I said, almost 2 years working it over, transcribing it letter for letter. And when he got all done, he was able to discover nearly 99% of what the original manuscript actually had to say. Now, in the 1950s, another scholar came by and he worked through some more, and he was able to detect a few more letters and make some corrections to what Tischendorf had done. Nowadays, that chemical reagent has come to the surface and it has affected the manuscript in such a way that it is starting to seriously damage the manuscript. Many of the letters are just hollow stencil outlines of their former selves, and when it gets much worse, then you're not going to even have any page left. So consequently, it's vital that we get this manuscript photographed digitally with UV light and probably with multispectral imaging or hyperspectral imaging as soon as we possibly can before we lose the text forever. Now, as I said, 99% of the manuscript has been deciphered by Tischendorf and a later scholar by the name of Lyon, but it hasn't been 100% deciphered. Using these other tools will be able to help us to do that. And one of the key places that we do not see any of the text at all is the first verse or 2 verses or even 3 verses of every single book of the New Testament. And that's because the scribe originally wrote in red letters at that point. How do we know this? Well, because we know that scribes did that sort of thing. There's another famous manuscript here at the Bibliothèque Nationale that I also saw today, Codex Clermontanus from the 6th century. And it had red letters. It was prettier ink. It was used for more special material, if you will, and yet at the same time, it would not last nearly as long as the regular ink, and it's completely vanished. The only way to recover those first couple of verses in every book of the New Testament, I believe, is going to be with something like multispectral imaging. But it's something that needs to be done and needs to be done in the next few years before we lose this manuscript forever.